A quick note of thanks. Thank you to all either in person or on Zoom. And thank you to my Smith College Libraries colleagues, Taya Dempsey, whose logistical prowess made all of this happen, Leslie Fields, Bina Williams, Sydney Wen, Betsy Schreier, and Beth Myers, and Information Technology Stanford Cluett for their help in making today's program possible. So the Enid Mark Lecture Series is officially titled Enid Mark Lecture on Poetry and Contemporary Book Arts, was created in honor of artist, writer, and publisher Enid Mark, Smith College, class of 1954. Enid Mark studied English literature and studio art here at Smith. She pursued painting and printmaking and photolithography. In 1986, she founded the Elm Press. She was passionate about words and imagery and was deeply thoughtful about all aspects of her books. Smith College Special Collections is lucky to steward many of Enid's book works, and I invite you to explore them during our reading room open hours. We're grateful to Enid and her family, including her late husband, Gene, and her son, Peter, who I saw somewhere. There's Peter. Hello, Peter. He's present here today, for envisioning and enabling this lecture series to happen. Thank you so much to the Mark family. Introduction to Julie Chen. So the 2023 Enid Mark Lecture is given by Julie Chen. Julie Chen is an internationally known book artist who has been publishing limited edition artist books under the Flying Fish Press imprint for over 30 years. Her books combine text, images, and innovative book structures to create reading and thinking experiences that go far beyond a simple turning of a page. Her work can be found in numerous collections worldwide, including the Library of Congress, the Victoria and Albert Museum, and of course, Smith College Special Collections. In 2009, she was featured artist in the PBS television series Craft in America, and in 2020 was one of the featured artists in the documentary film The Bookmakers. She is a professor of art at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So I first learned about Julie's artist books in about 2007, when many artists, book artists and craftspeople gathered for the Codex Artist Book Fair at the University of California, Berkeley. I still remember my awe at the interdimensionality of her table, each distinct complex piece drawing my eyes. Each one was so different, and yet her colors and design aesthetics, along with her intricate constructions, were a through line, stating emphatically that this is a book by Julie Chen. The Smith College community really engages with artist books as objects of inquiry and slow sensorial noticing. Julie's work is a favorite in nearly every class in which I share them. A fundamental question I always ask of a book is, what is this book doing? Julie's work doesn't provide an easy answer. Rather, her work engages our sensoria and asks us to pause and think with it. She builds space into her detailed, layered work for readers to ask questions and to participate in forming, shifting, and meaning making, into materially exploring big ideas, from grasping climate change to the process of learning itself. If, as Arthur C. Clarke noted, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, I think Julie's work embodies this space of what might be possible and how we might begin to understand our vast and complex world. Today, we had some examples of Julie's and Enid's work in the Special Collections reading room on the 3rd floor, and I hope at least some of you had the chance to explore these deeply immersive books. You can also visit during our reading room open hours and request them. And now, Julie will discuss some of her recent work and share how she designs and produces them, which involves designing, engineering, printing, binding, and the creative alchemy of art. Her talk is entitled, "At the Intersection of Content, Process, and Magic, the Artist's Book Experience." Please join me in welcoming Julie Chen.
Can you hear me? Is this good? Okay. All right. I would like to thank Shannon Zeppel for inviting me to give the Enid Mark Lecture on Contemporary Poetry and Book Arts. It's an honor to be here at Smith College, giving a lecture named for the talented and innovative talented and innovative artist and publisher, Enid Mark. It's also an honor to be a woman book artist, giving a lecture at a women's college that is named for a well-known and respected woman in book art. One thing that Shannon didn't mention in my bio is that I taught at Mills College in Oakland, California for 27 years, which was one of the first women's colleges west of the Mississippi, and unfortunately is no longer, it's now co-ed because they had to merge with another school. But it's wonderful for me to be back at a women's college in an environment that I've spent so many years championing women's education. So I'm giving my lecture using my paper notes. We couldn't quite get the technology to work, so hopefully it won't be too disruptive to hear like the paper rustling as I turn the pages. So I'm going to start my talk by reading from an early book of mine called You Are Here. This was just the second artist book that I made after finishing graduate school that contained my own text and image. So I had published a couple of collaborations around this time with older and more established artists, but I was still working on finding my own voice in the medium of artist books. I'm starting my talk with this book because even though it's relatively simple in both structure and concept compared to many of the books that I've made since then, it captures something elemental about my deep sense of connection to the artist book form, even from this early period in my career when I was in my late 20s and just starting out in the field. You are here. I would make for you a map, charting the twists and turns of the human heart, with a legend showing where laughter is and how to navigate the rough terrain of solitude. So you would know where you were and how you came to be here. So that you could plot your course with care, to spare your fragile heart unnecessary pain and anguish. Contemplate the roads which might seem impassable or merely improbable. Consider the relative merits of various routes to your chosen destination. But perhaps it is the pain itself that paves the road on which we choose to travel. Anguish that gives color and texture to the landscape. Then wouldn't there be a greater value in the knowing, in seeing the possibilities laid out in grids and squares of agony and despair, in meanderings of indecision, the topography of rage? The map that I would make you would have no ambiguities, would show you exactly where you might go and what conditions you might find should you ever choose to go there. I first saw this structure in one of the early editions of Keith Smith's book, Non-Adhesive Binding, Books Without Paste or Glue, which is a how-to book for making different book structures. This is called a border book. And the thing I found so exciting about this structure is that the reader would be unfolding the map as they were reading a text about creating a map. When I say this out loud, it seems so obvious. But at the time, the idea that the physical book could not just contribute to the experience of the reader, but could, in its physical form, constitute that experience seemed like a revelation. What followed as time went on was a series of books in which the manipulation of the structure by the reader was a key component of the piece. Without analyzing what I was doing at the time, I can see now that my interest was in creating not just well-crafted book objects, but in taking the reader into a new immersive reality through their interaction with these objects. Fast forward many years into the future when I added teaching into my career mix and started designing projects that would help guide students toward discovering and utilizing the full potential of the artist book form. One of the key questions I always ask my students when talking about their projects is this: What experience are you trying to give the reader? This is a question that I also always ask myself when I am working on a new project, and a question that I hope I am drilling deeply enough into the brains of my students that they will continue to ask it of themselves when making books after school, after they leave school. This is usually followed by one of my favorite mottos. I say it so often in classes, that my students can usually quote it back to me years after they have graduated. The book in your head does not really exist. I bring this up early in my talk because this motto speaks directly to the idea of the intersection of process and magic. The magic is in our heads, and the process is what helps us get it out into the world. Content is a vehicle by which we communicate our creative vision to the people around us. Without content and without process, the magic in our heads could end up remaining just that, an illusion that lives only within us. In order to illustrate the importance of process to the finished product, I'm going to take you behind the scenes and talk about what goes into creating a few of my books. In most cases, I consider an artist book, or one of my own artist books anyway, to be the most successful when the processes that go into making it do not call too much attention to themselves, as this can be distracting to the reader. Process is as important as the road that supports the reader on their experiential journey through the book, but it is not the journey itself. To use a different metaphor that has been used many times to describe things, many things besides the artist book, an artist book is like an iceberg. So there's the part that you see, but underneath it is the part that is supporting the whole structure that you can't see, and it's help keeping that whole structure upright. In an artist book, this could include things like research, model making of structures, writing, drawing, printing, binding, designing, and a host of other activities that go into turning a vision or idea into an object. So before ripping back the curtain and showing you some of the trials and tribulations that are part of the process of making books, for me anyway, I want to read you a little essay about Praxis Illustrated, which is an artist book that is about the creative process. This short essay appears in my catalog raisonné from 2016 called Reading the Object, and explains a bit about how making a book is not usually a straight line from point A to point B. So this is the essay from the catalog. In September of 2012, I was approached by Jill Lerner, then the director of the Ringling College of Art and Design's Letterpress and Book Art Center, affectionately known at Ringling as the Letterpress, with an invitation to be a visiting artist. With the help of students and volunteers, they would publish a piece of mine in a small edition. I would come out to Ringling for a week to do press checks and give a public lecture. This sounded like a wonderful opportunity, but when I asked them when they would like me to come, the answer was mid-November. This gave me just 2 months to develop and flesh out a new book project. For me, a very short period of time, because usually I make one book a year and it takes me a number of months to figure out what I'm doing, and then a number of months further to do the production work, and then a number of months further to start to get that first copy out the door. So I spent the rest of that day and most of the next day trying to figure out what kind of project I could feasibly develop and design in a month and a half, so they could make the proofs for the plates before I arrived in mid-November. Jill mentioned that a Florida-related theme was encouraged but not required. My daughter had long been an avid fruit lover. One might even go so far as to call her a fruit fanatic. Because of this, I had toyed for years with the idea of making an artist book about fruit. Because Florida and California, where I lived at the time, are both such big citrus growing regions, this I decided was my chance to realize my fruit book dreams. Because time was so short, I immediately started doing research about citrus cultivation and learned quite a few very interesting facts about citrus fruits. I asked Jill to have someone go to the market in Sarasota and purchase as many varieties of citrus as were available and take photographs of them. At this point, I wasn't sure what direction the book would ultimately take, but I was committed to including citrus in some significant way. In the process of doing citrus research, I became increasingly interested in color theory, as well as the cultural responses that people have to various colors. and my research soon expanded to include those topics as well. October rolled around and I was still not quite sure where all this research was leading. Almost all my previous editions had taken at least 4 to 6 months to develop, so I was feeling pressed for time to come to some kind of content resolution. After a great deal of soul searching and late night sessions with notes and reference books strewn around me, it finally dawned on me that this book was going to be about the creative process itself. The condensed time constraints I was working under continually forced me to be much more aware of my own creative process than I would normally be. This in turn led me to consider advice I had given my students over the years about honoring their own processes when making artist books, and also gave me a great deal of empathy for the very short deadlines under which students must produce creative work. The text for Praxis Illustrated is very much like a letter of advice to my students, as well as to myself as an artist, illustrated meaningfully with images of citrus fruits in real life colors, and including several movable mechanisms and foldouts that visually and experientially explain various concepts. In the end, the book took much longer to complete than any of us imagined. All the printing was done at Ringling using over 120 plates, and the binding was done in my own studio. So I'm going to show you the whole book and do a reading from the book. Start anywhere. Make the decision to begin. Delve into whatever interests you at the moment, no matter how unlikely it may seem. Any topic could be the catalyst that ignites the creative process. Never dismiss the mundane as a starting point for deep and meaningful work. Choose a line of inquiry. Keep an open mind. Engage in research that is wide as well as deep. Be prepared for your activities to spark new ideas that will propel you in unforeseen directions. You may have yet to discover, this was from the previous slide, you have yet to discover the concept that will eventually become the focus of your work. Immerse yourself in the process. Observe. Take a step back from your thought process. Pay attention to subtle discrepancies between perception and interpretation in your experience of the world around you. Allow unexpected connections in your thinking to emerge. You never know where or how far an idea may take you. Investigate. Do not rush to finalize your plans. Stay open to the possibility that your intentions and ideas may shift numerous times, perhaps in dramatic ways, before you fully understand what you are doing. This page also contains 2 rotating wheels that you can see at the tops of the pages. And these contain both text and images that appear in small oval windows on the page. The text on the first wheel deals with the act of seeing, and the text on the second wheel deals with the perception of color. Encompass, define, identify the objective of your activity and the vocabulary with which you will speak. Iterate, iterate, iterate. The work in your mind does not really exist. Do not confuse the theoretical with the concrete. Articulate your vision. Proceed in whatever direction the work impels you to go. Address the merging of form and content. Surrender yourself to the narrative. Recognize the moment of completion. So this is the last page of the book, and it has 3 full bells, so it turns the fruit into unnatural colors. So I'm going to jump forward in time and talk about the process of making one of my more recent books called Wayfinding, which was being shown upstairs in the library. And this was published in 2019, but I started it in 2017. And here is a brief backstory of how this book got started. I had a 30-year retrospective exhibition at the University of Washington Libraries in Seattle and invited my whole family to come up for the opening. After my artist talk, my daughter Eleanor, who is now in her mid-30s, asked me what seemed like a simple question. She said, "I notice you don't use a lot of texture in your books. Why is that?" I explained that as a printer, I am interested in turning textures into visual patterns that can be printed using letterpress. She countered with what at the time seemed like a very straightforward challenge. She said, "I think you should try to use texture in your next book." I decided to take up this challenge, which ended up taking me into a 2-year-long journey about ideas having to do with the physical versus the visual, and then ended up being a much more difficult task for me than I could have imagined. When she said it, I thought, okay, no problem, I can do that. No, it didn't work out that way. So after a number of false starts, the theme for wayfinding developed into an exploration about the differences in experience between physical learning and mental learning. It consists of 4 trays that are hinged together. The first full opening reveals 2 trays containing 3-dimensional cast paper elements, that's the texture, and 2 booklets that are formatted in dragon scale bindings, which is an ancient Chinese style of binding that goes back to the Tang Dynasty. The pages are staggered to reveal a continuous image along the edges of the pages that changes to a different continuous image as the pages are turned. The book opens up further to reveal a series of alphabets starting on the left with diagrams for flag semaphore, which is a type of gesture alphabet used to convey messages across physical distances and was primarily used in maritime communications. It has also been used in mountainous areas where visual communication is more practical and reliable than oral or electronic communication. And it's still used today, even though we have so many other ways of communicating. So how did the idea of using texture in a book result in this complex piece with multiple boxes and books? The road was very long and windy and rather tedious at times, but I'll stick to the highlights for the purpose of this talk. So this is where I get to rip back the curtain and show you a lot of the mistakes and wrong turns. So usually at the beginning of a project, I start with an idea for a physical structure. I know from experience that the structure will change over time, but I have to have something physical to hang my ideas on. The plan to include the dragon scale binding was one that I had from the very beginning and is one of the few things that made it through to the final design. Because I was working with this idea for a zigzag page shape at the top edges, the pages also had to be shaped in order to be hidden within the accordion structure. So those are the kinds of things that if you don't actually start making models, you don't realize. Like a student will think, I have this great idea, but then they start making it and realize, oh, I have to shape the pages as well because my other parts are shaped. It makes sense once you see it in person, but in your head, those details, you usually gloss over those things. Once I had this initial structure model, I started to focus on developing content. My original plan hinged on using P22 blocks, which is a modular type system made out of molded plastic. P22 also made a digital version of this type system, so I was able to start out designing my designs on the computer before moving to the physical blocks, pieces of type. In the early stages of the project, I started to think about giving the blocks elements different patterns. This was my take on including texture, which in hindsight, and as you can see, is not really texture at all, but patterns representing texture, but somehow in my mind, it's like I'm using texture. So I ended up ditching this, the idea of using blocks, but not after I made a fairly extensive series of studies using the texture, adding texture to the blocks. This is just a small portion of the printouts of some of my test compositions. Meanwhile, the zigzag accordion structure was morphing into a series of trays that would be hinged together and would contain the dragon scale booklets and other items. I experimented with using the Japanese screen hinge structure to connect the trays. On the content development front, after scrapping the idea of using P22 blocks, I started experimenting with laser cutting patterns in handmade paper. As you can see, my ideas about texture were still based in pattern. At least things were a tiny bit 3D now, but still not very successful as texture. This idea got scrapped after making just this one test. Meanwhile, a new content idea emerged that set me off on a completely new direction. I decided to work with the diagrams for flag semaphore that I mentioned earlier, which is that physical alphabet, and it's made by a person waving flags in specific positions to create letter forms. I felt that at last, I was moving towards incorporating texture into a book, although I didn't know yet exactly how. The idea of a physical alphabet seemed to me to be going in the right direction. So I decided to create a shape alphabet based on the flag semaphore diagrams that I would later translate into 3-dimensional textures using cast paper. At this point in my career, I had never made cast paper before. I'd made paper, but not cast paper. But sometimes not knowing how to do something is actually a blessing in disguise. Because if you don't know how difficult or complicated a process is, you won't dismiss it out of hand. But more on this later. Here are some early compositional studies for using the shape alphabet as part of the page designs. And this test uses layers of color to suggest dimensions that are based on that shape alphabet in the background. Meanwhile, the zigzag structure had lost its allure for me somewhere along the way. I felt now that I was going in the direction of the content being about mental and physical learning, the zigzag shape wasn't adding anything meaningful to the project any longer. So I started to model out a similar plan for a series of box trays hinged together in accordion format that were rectangular and all the same size. This was the working model in my head for quite some time. This was in my head still. Notice that the partial model in the slide is not a full accordion. It's just 2 hinged trays. So I'm thinking, aha, I made a model. I know where I'm going. Wrong again. Months passed before I got around to making a full model of the structure that I had in my head. And as could be predicted, I ended up really disliking it. But I only realized it wasn't working with my content ideas after I invested the time to make the model. I'm always telling my students to make models. I usually do it. This time I waited longer than I should have. So I had to go back to the drawing board yet again. I still wanted to use trays that were hinged together, but not in accordion format. Finally, a version of the structure emerged that is very close to the one I ended up using for the book. The trays would be hinged on both the right and left side and fold up towards the center. Researching mental learning and physical learning got me to thinking about the differences in ways people interact with the physical world. I am a mental learner, and I also happen to be afraid of heights. So the idea of rock climbing in a rock climbing gym or in nature, either one, has never appealed to me. My daughter, however, loves climbing, and that got me to thinking about why our interests were so different. Could part of it be based on our preferred ways of learning? I decided to use rock wall imagery for the book and to create rock wall textures using cast paper. This is an early example of the gradient file used to make the mold for casting the paper. Figuring out how to communicate with the software on a CNC router turned out to be a whole process in and of itself, which took many tests and many failed attempts before we got it right. It looks like it should give you the thing that you want from the 3D, the gradient file, but the machine was reading it completely differently. So here's a shot of the rigid foam mold that was cut on the CNC router for the cast paper. And here is a shot showing the process of adding colored paper pulp to the mold next to a shot of the finished cast sheet. I had the molds made at Logos Graphics in San Francisco since I didn't have a CNC machine myself. We cut designs based on both rock wall surfaces and the shape alphabet I designed from the flag semaphore diagrams. So here's a couple of shots of the paper casting process in which colored pulp is being patted into the mold. And after the recesses are filled, the excess water has to be blotted. Then another layer of pulp is patted over the shapes to start creating the sheet, and then blotted again. And then even more pulp is patted in and blotted. This is just a quick overview of the process, which leaves a lot of the intermediate steps left out. It's a very tedious and long process to make one sheet of cast paper. Once the mold is filled, we put it in a dry box for a couple of days. And once it's dry, it can be peeled out of the mold. And only then do we know if the casting was successful. For the edges of the pages, I decided to contrast an image of a man-made rock wall surface with an image of a natural rock surface. These would be cut into strips and attached to the edges of the dragon scale pages in order to create continuous images across the pages. All the slides up to this point show things that happened during the first year of development for the project. At this point, the project is starting to really take shape. Here is the working model for the book that is pretty close to the final form of the piece. I decided to add triangular panels to the right and left edges because I needed more room for content within the structure. These panels would also house some of the magnets that would help keep the book closed. And here is a shot of the printed content and other elements shown, placed in the spaces shown in the model in the previous slide. It was only during the second year of the project that the text got written and all the other elements of the piece finally got finalized and printed. We set up a system for making the cast paper in my backyard. This shot shows a translation of flag semaphore diagrams into layered shapes, and then into shapes and then layered shapes. And here's an example of the 3 variations of the shape alphabet that went into the final piece as window cutouts, as printed shapes, and as cast paper. And here's an image of the gradient file that finally worked to have the CNC machine make the mold. And it's next to the cast paper sheet that came out of that gradient file. And the 3-dimensional alphabet shapes are spelling out the words texture and pattern in vertical columns of letters. The shapes also appear as cutout windows at the end of each dragon scale booklet, spelling out the words gesture and reason, also vertically. The next few slides show the turning of the pages on the dragon scale booklets. At the start, the images showing on the edges of the pages of the left booklet is that of a natural rock wall. And as you turn the pages, the image on the edges of the back sides of those pages revealed the image of the man-made rock wall. So one type of surface is turning into the other type of surface until it completely takes the place of that original image. And then if you start turning the pages on the right side, that image of the man-made rock wall turns into an image of the natural rock wall. And as you can see by the turning of the pages, the image that appears on the right side is an extension of the image that appears on the left side when it's closed. One of the things that my daughter asked to be included in this book is paper that made a lot of noise when it's turned. Because as a physical learner, sound is as important to her as texture. So I had paper made at the Morgan Conservatory in Cleveland, Ohio, that was designed to have a loud rattle when handled. So I have this short video. I don't think am I attached to, hooked up to sound? We'll try it. But this is just like a few second video that the library staff at Louisiana State University made to demonstrate the sound. And this does not appear anywhere in the book that, oh, the sound is important. So the fact that they picked up on that and made a video was really a great affirmation that we were getting somewhere. So I don't know if you can you sort of hear that? It's pretty loud when you're actually handling the book. Wayfinding ended up becoming one of the most complex and ambitious projects I've ever undertaken, and it all started with a simple challenge to use texture. I learned a great deal not only about new processes and materials, but also about myself as a learner and how my learning experience differs so vastly from that of my daughters. And you think I would have known that as a mother, but we didn't find that out about each other until we were working on this project. So I'm going to now move on to a book from 2021 that I did with book artist Carrie Michelani Schroeder. This is called Book of Hours, and I'm going to play this video while I'm explaining a little bit about the book. Carrie Michelani Schroeder was a student of mine in the graduate program at Mills College, and then worked as my studio assistant for 3 years. She is now a well-regarded book artist in her own right, and we have become good friends and colleagues. When Carrie approached me right before the pandemic about the possibility of doing a collaborative artist book on the theme of time, I was very interested, but so overextended with other projects that I told her I would have to think about it. The pandemic changed so many things, including both my studio and teaching practices, that in March of 2020, I told Carrie that I wanted to clear the decks and start working on our book right away. And I was actually supposed to say that before I started showing you the video. But anyway, so you're probably wondering, what is going on in this book? So this structure, we decided to use is called a blow book, which is a historical book structure that was often used by magicians to mystify the public, seeming to show ever-changing content within a single book. The book contains 12 sequences, which was way more complicated to make than making 12 separate books would have been. 4 of the sequences were designed jointly, and we each created 4 sequences of our own. This was a long distance project, as Carrie lives in San Antonio, Texas, and I lived at the time in the San Francisco Bay Area. All of our communications took place via email, phone, or Zoom. Little did we know that it would be a year and a half before travel restrictions were lifted and we could unite all the pages in one location. It's impossible to describe in a few words how hard this book was to produce, but the pagination involved in organizing pages of the pages for 12 sequences, 6 on one side of the book and 6 on the other, was complicated in the extreme. It turned out to be a good project to work on during the isolation of the pandemic because it took a huge amount of concentration and during the year-long process to make sure everything got printed on the correct page and in the correct orientation. We decided that the content of our book would focus on the perception of time, given that everyone's perception of time was being changed radically by the isolation of lockdown and the disruption to the routines of everyday life. I'm going to talk about a few of the sequences in the book, as well as explaining a little bit about the process of making the book. In order to make this book, we had to make a physical model, of course, to show us what needed to be printed on every page. Since the content of half the book is upside down in relation to the other half, the print pagination was extremely complicated. We had to make multiple diagrams to help ensure that there would be no mistakes. Since one wrongly placed print that was either on the wrong page or in the wrong orientation would spoil the whole effect of the book. There was no way to double check whether we were printing things correctly during the process, since half the pages were in Texas and the other half were in California. So we just had to trust to fate and to the accuracy of our diagrams and models. I was having a lot of trouble getting started with this project, mostly because of all the life changes that I, like all of us, had to adjust to during the first few months of the pandemic. One of the first things I decided I wanted to include in the book was a series of portraits of my family and friends. So I asked people to take selfies of themselves, both with and without a face mask on, and send them to me. And then with the help of my studio assistants, Asa Nakata and Connie Lee, who were working from home by this time because nobody could travel anywhere, they posterized each of the photos. And then from the posterized image, they made digital line drawings that were made in 3 layers. These line drawings were used to cut these layers of paper using a laser cutter. So here's an example of taking the line drawing and putting color back in just so I could see where the layers of paper would go. The image that would eventually get printed is using a method called pressure printing, in which a paper collage is used to create the image. So I have three layers of paper makes the darkest area, 2 layers makes like the gray area, and then no paper or just the background paper is the white. So you're not printing from a printing block, you're printing using a collage that's behind the paper. It's kind of hard to explain if you're not already familiar with letterpress printing. And here's a shot of how 2 portraits eventually get printed for the book. Due to the complex pagination, the portraits that get printed next to each other on the page do not appear next to each other in the book. They also have to get printed upside down from each other in order to appear right side up in the book. So you can imagine just making sure everybody's appearing in the right place and the right orientation was really difficult. So the portraits are separated into layers, and then each layer is cut on a laser cutter. So here's a speeded up little video of the laser cutter cutting out one of the layers. So you can see the laser cutter really just follows your digital drawing or your digital file really faithfully. So everything that was in the drawing will be cut using the laser. So fortunately for me, I had a laser cutter in my studio that I've had for almost 20 years now, or over 20 years now. So when lockdown occurred, I was able to do a lot of this work in my own studio. So I didn't have to try and find a shop that would, be able to work on stuff and let me come and work with them. So that was very helpful or lucky for me. So this is what the cut layers look like after they're cut. Here's that other layer. So part of the detail is on the darker layer. And then I have to remove some of the pieces that don't get used as part of the image. And then the remaining pieces get adhered to a backing sheet using a dry mount adhesive that was already melted onto the back of the paper before it was cut. So we don't have to like try and put glue on the back of all those little details because it's already on there. And then this is the resulting pressure print made from that paper collage. My studio assistants did the initial drawings, which took them 4 to 6 hours per portrait. But I had to go back in and adjust each drawing for the cutter, which allowed me to spend 2 to 3 hours looking at each person's image. While not quite the same as seeing them in person, it gave me a surprisingly deep sense of connection to the people in my life at a time when we can only look at each other from afar. Because when you think about it, how often do you stare into the eyes of people in your life for 2 or 3 hours at a time? But even though it was on the computer screen and it was just a drawing, I still felt like I was looking at the person. It was kind of a very unexpected emotional experience to do this part of the book. But one of the other unexpected consequences of making portraits of people I care about is that I can't throw away all the parts that didn't get used because I can still recognize all the people. So I have since moved to Wisconsin, and this folder full of face parts has come with me. So here's a short video of printing one of the sheets. If you look at the cylinder as it rolls forward after the print comes off, you can sort of see the collage that's taped to the cylinder, but those blocks in the press bed are just blank. You can you can almost see the shadow of a portrait, but that's just because of the way the paper is taking the ink. There's actually nothing on those blocks. The image is coming from the collage. So as I roll it forward, it goes over the ink. And then in that corner, you can sort of see the collage just sitting on the press as it rolls. There it goes. And then here's the resulting print. So here's a short video of the portrait sequence of people unmasked. And here's the sequence on the other side with the same people, but they're all wearing their face masks. So while I was busy creating pressure print portraits of people, my friends and family, Carrie was thinking along the same lines, but took a different angle and asked her friends and family to send her photos of their hands. The hand reaching out from the right side is always Carrie's, and the hands reaching out from the left side are her friends and family. So we didn't know that each of us was going to do this, but we each decided to do this. And I find this sequence particularly poignant because the hands are reaching for each other and they can never touch over the gutter of the page spread. And then one of the other things that we didn't plan in advance, we both ended up working with, is having some of our sequences be directly about COVID, because we were doing this during lockdown. And this is Carrie's COVID view, which contains headlines from the news during the first year of the pandemic. And then the red dots represent the number of infections in the state of Texas during that year. But I'm going to talk a little bit about one of the sequences that I made about COVID. This is called what I refer to as big numbers, both due to the size of the type and because the numbers shown document the rising rate of infection during the first few months of the pandemic. Let me go back. So this is my interpretation of the COVID balls that many artists did interpretations of that silhouette on the other side. Early on, partially out of a sense of disbelief and panic, I started a spreadsheet to keep track of the infection and death rates in San Francisco, in the San Francisco Bay Area and the state of California and the United States. I also kept track of infection and death rates in Alameda County, where I was living at the time. And I kept this for over 2 years before I finally, it started to slow down. And the gaps are dates that I just happened to forget to do it. But as you can see, there was a lot of times when every day I was keeping this record. I translated this collected data into a list of numbers. The increasing numbers on the versos is paired with an increasing number of COVID balls on the rectos. These two slides show the first 8 pages of the sequence. And there was no easy way to see how the pages in the sequence were going to look as they were being flipped, because again, half of the pages were in Texas and half of the pages were in California. So I had to just take pictures of some of the pages and make a little video on my phone so I could sort of see, like, is it gonna work? You know, but this is just sort of doing like a little DIY version, because I couldn't actually cut the pages up because there were parts of the pages were elsewhere. And this is the text from the sequence. Let me see. Okay, so I'm just going to read the text with this slide. I used to dream about having the ability to stop time for everyone except myself, to freeze everyone in place in such a way that they would be unaware of being harmlessly paused. What seemed like a momentary lapse in time for the world would be for me a period of activity outside of the daily stream of life. It seemed like such a small thing to wish for, a day, a week, a month, time to catch up to myself without the conveyor belt of time constantly pulling me forward. I should have been more careful with my wishes, considered the consequences of having everything come to a stop. I should have remembered that a game of tag could freeze you far from where you hope to be, far from everything you hold dear. So this is a sequence of, or this is a video of that sequence. The sequence that got printed on the same sheet with the big number sequence is based on the Doomsday Clock. The Doomsday Clock is put out by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. It was started in 1947 with the first use of nuclear weapons. The idea for the clock is somewhat self-explanatory, with the amount of time left before midnight showing how close the world is to self-destruction. The Bulletin's Science and Security Board meets twice a year to discuss world events and decide when the clock needs to be reset. The clock was set farthest from midnight in 1991, 17 minutes, with the end of the Cold War. I got the idea to create a sequence based on the Doomsday Clock from Carrie. She was originally planning to create a sequence referring to the Doomsday Clock, but later changed her mind. And so I jumped at the chance and asked her if I could use it instead, and she said yes. My goal was to figure out a way to animate the changes in the amount of time left before midnight for the flipping of the pages, and I decided to use an image of the Earth in red, being partially covered by the time left on the clock in blue. As the pages are flipped, the blue swings back and forth, but in the end, it gets down to just a sliver of 100 seconds, which is where we are today, well, where we were in 2020. The Doomsday Clock is currently set in 2023 to 90 seconds before midnight. So I'm just going to read you the text from this sequence while you're looking at all these clocks. A clock had been set before you were born, showing a different construct of time than the one you believed to be true. On this clock, time could march forward and slip back again, and could even stand still for years on end. Events in the world had been turned into minutes, and time was being counted not in lifetimes, but in tiny increments that you normally take for granted, never imagining that what seemed like an inconsequential blip in your daily schedule could turn out to be the beginning of the end of time. The idea that your life is untethered from the lives of everyone around you is a mirage that you cling to in order to maintain a sense of control in the face of your increasing awareness that if time is running out for the planet, then it is also running out for you and for everyone you love. Picture their faces in your mind's eye and try to remember everything about them in an instant. If the current time can no longer be turned back, you have 100 seconds left. So this is a video of that sequence. So you can see the sliver moving backwards and forward till it goes down to almost nothing. Oops. Oh yeah, that's right. So I'm going to end my talk by showing you some slides of my most recent book called The Accretion of Identity. I had wanted to work on a piece about my personal identity for many years, but it never seemed quite like the right time. And I kept making decisions to forward other projects ahead of an identity book. In fact, this project was the one I started before the pandemic, but instead of continuing with it, at the time, I decided to put it off indefinitely to work on Book of Hours with Carrie Schroeder. I'm glad now that I chose to wait because the pandemic contributed in a meaningful way to my experience and understanding of my own identity. The structure used for the book is called a Chinese thread book, or Zhen Zhen Bao. So I'm going to show you a video while I explain a little bit. See if this works. Yeah. This structure consists of layers of folded paper boxes that get increasingly larger with each successive layer. The thread book was used by women in Chinese minority groups who practiced traditional embroidery techniques and was used to house their needles, threads, and patterns. As a book artist, I had been aware of this structure for many years, but never had a content idea that I felt would fully utilize the attributes of the structure. When I started this project, it did not immediately occur to me that this structure might be a good one to use for content about my idea as an Asian American who is half Japanese and half Chinese. But in the end, this proved to be the perfect structure, not only for its cultural associations, because of the way in which its content is revealed in layers. All of the imagery for this book centers around a portrait of my face, which I use in various iterations to symbolize levels of distance between me and the world around me. On the cover of the box, a silhouette is used to give only a rather anonymous hint about the idea of identity. Opening the box further reveals a portrait with half of the visual information missing, indicating either an unfinished or not fully known or understood identity. When the box is fully open, definitions for the words accretion and identity frame a series of 16 colorful folded stars. The cheerful colors and pleasing folded shapes are meant to offer the reader what at first glance may seem like a simple and playful reading experience, but instead turns out to be the gateway to a more complicated and uneasy set of contents. The first layer of boxes reveals 16 questions that I have been asked many times as a person of color. Some of the questions, such as, "Where are you from?" may seem innocuous to the casual observer, but from the view of the questionee are anything but. This question is sometimes followed by a more intrusive question, such as, "Where were you born?" or "Where are you really from?" The text is written directly over pressure printed portraits of my face that contain only a very basic level of detail. And if you've ever tried to Google me as a book artist, you won't find that many pictures because I am a very private person and don't like to have my picture taken. So when I decided to use my face as the main component, it took a lot of soul searching and thought, but in the end I decided I had to do that. The second layer of boxes contains 8 photographic portraits of me at various ages. Overlaid onto each image is a strip of colored paper containing a label that has been used to describe me by others or used by me to describe my perception of how I am seen by others. The third layer of boxes contains 4 narratives about my experience of identity at different times in my life. And I'm going to read the 4th narrative that is shown in this box. which is the one that has a connection to the pandemic. At the beginning of the pandemic, the social isolation of lockdown was difficult and weird, but there was a sense that everyone was in the same boat. We were all isolating together for our own safety as well as for the greater good. But as the months of lockdown wore on, news about violence against Asian Americans started to emerge. At first, I managed to keep these incidents at arm's length, rationalizing that something like that could never happen to me or to anyone I knew. But as restrictions began to ease, I could no longer hide from myself the fact that my avoidance of public transportation and public places stemmed from more than just anxiety about COVID. The realization of being seen as the other, while never fully absent, was now always present in my mind, and with it came a sense of hypervigilance towards the world around me. The fourth and final layer of boxes shows the most complete version of my portrait, pressure printed as a series of colored squares. As a book artist, I have used the box form in many ways over the course of my career, and it seems fitting that in a book about identity, various images of me appear in boxes upon boxes in my attempt to present and describe my identity as an artist, as a woman, and as a person of color. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julie. That was wonderful. I want to invite the room to ask some questions. Maybe if someone can turn the lights back on, that would be handy too. If you're in the room, please raise your hand and I will bring the mic over to you. If you're on Zoom, you can write in the Q&A and Leslie will kindly read the question. But it looks like Peter has a question. Okay.
First of all, thank you for coming here. It's a great talk.
No, my pleasure.
How many you make each edition? How large is each edition?
So when I first started as making books, my editions were much larger. So I would make like 100 copies. And then maybe about 15 years ago, maybe a little longer, I started cutting them down because it was taking us so long. And by us, I mean me and my studio assistants, to put all those books together. Years and years, sometimes it would take to get to the end of the edition. So now I do between 30 and 50 copies. And that has allowed me to spend more time working on new work instead of spending a lot of time putting together old work. But we are still putting together some of those big editions of 100. Some of the later editions of 50 we're done with, so it's kind of.
How many total artist books have you made so far?
I think I've made about 30, between 30 and 35. And some of them, I've done a few, I've done one open edition that was offset printed and it was much simpler format. It's called How Books Work and they have it here at the library. And that I think we made 300 or 400 of those. But it only has 2 sheets of paper and we were able to fold that, put it together. But some of these other projects just have so many pieces and so many complicated parts that even doing 30 it's a really time consuming process.
All your books upstairs before here and now. Okay, I'm struck by the sheer variety of formats and how inventive they all are.
Yeah, I love structure and I'm always like looking for different kinds of structures, but I'll sit on a structure until I have an idea that I feel really utilizes it. And I've had to wait for years sometimes in order to come up with a project idea. There was one book I didn't show called Full Circle, has a big rotating wheel in it. And I really wanted to make a book with a wheel. I don't know why, but in my mind, it's like, I want to make a wheel book, but I couldn't come up with an idea. So every time I was working on a new project, it's like, could this be the wheel book? It's like, no, there's no really reason to have a wheel. So this went on for like 5 years. And finally, I started working on this idea for a book about belief, not religious belief, but just our everyday beliefs. Like we believe the sun will rise tomorrow and all that. And I've realized that a lot of those beliefs are circular. I thought, oh, I think this is the wheel book. So I was able to finally make the book that was like mostly, it was just this big wheel that had all this information on it. And when you're done, you start right at the beginning and you can just keep going round and round. So.
I'll use my moderator's
Okay.
opportunity to ask a question. I'm curious how you've seen book arts shift over the time you've been creating work and also teaching people how to create books. If there are particular sort of approaches or common themes or structures that you're really seeing sort of take shape over the sort of arc of time you've been working in this field?
I don't think anyone's ever asked me that, but I think one of the main differences between when I was starting out and now is there's so much more information available to people, and so many more people in the field who are teaching other people. When I first started, there weren't that many people teaching workshops on how to make even basic bindings. And now you can go to a number of places, or you can get your information online. You can take a workshop online with really great instructors and learn how to make almost anything. And so there is more variety in what people are doing in their studios than there used to be. And then also the availability of digital printing and other types of printing, low entry point printing, has helped people really focus on their ideas and be able to make things. So when I first started, letterpress was really your only option. This was, gonna date me, but it's before you could even do color copying, or the home printer did not exist. The computer didn't exist, when I got my first computer, my first Apple computer, like 2 years out of graduate school, and there just weren't any back before then. And so slowly the idea that you could print at home, the laser printer, and then you could print in color. I mean, now, it's available to everybody. So I think that's really helped. I think though, on the downside, I feel like there are more things that are being made without instruction. And so, and I sometimes it's hard to see those things because people have really interesting ideas, but they just don't really know what they're doing. And so my hope for that is for people, once they get kind of bitten by the book bug, is that they will search out more ways to learn, not only how to make things, but also just how to strategize, do their content strategies, so that they can really get those ideas, into a form that will work. So I think one of the main differences is we're more mainstream now. I mean, more people are aware of book art than it used to be, and also there's more activity. But I still think there's a need for formal education of various sorts. And I'm glad that there are so many people who have been graduating from book art MFA programs that are out there teaching, so that information is available to more people.
Thank you.
Again, I have to thank you so much. The inspiration that you've shared so generously, it's just really touched me. But I want to ask you, you talked quite a bit about research, and that's a very interesting topic for me. And my question for you is the idea of going in deep and with breadth and exploring and not letting yourself, how do you decide when you know you've done all the research you're going to do? How do you know that that idea is the one you're going to pursue?
Well, okay, so there are two parts to that question. Like when do I know when I'm done with the research, and how do I know what I'm going to do? So at a certain point, because I make one book a year generally, and I can't, at a certain point I have to make a decision. Well, this is because I always have a lot of ideas. It's like, okay, this is the one I think I'm going to work on, and then I'll start to do research on that. And usually something during the research process captures my imagination, and then the project could go off on a tangent from where I thought it was going to go, but I always let the research take me where it needs to take me. But then time comes in, right? Because I don't have endless time. I tell my students this during the semester. It's like, you still have time, but you don't have endless time, and we're like, classes are going to end in 2 weeks, and it's like, your time is getting smaller. So it's like that for me though. It's like I have a year, but okay, my time is getting smaller. I need to like figure out what I need to do to complete, I feel would complete my research so I can move on to the creative part. So that's a big factor in saying, okay, you're out of time now. Look at what you have and figure out, do you have enough? Maybe you have another week. So if there's something missing, go get it, go figure out what you need. And then I take whatever that is and I move on to really, and I'm also writing and thinking about things at the same time. But I think that can be a problem if people don't keep themselves on a schedule. It's like, well, I'm not done. I have to do more research. I have to do, because you could do endless research and it's fun and it's, it's really fascinating. But if you're trying to make work at a certain point, you have to make that work, so I think for me that it's just like for my students, only I have a little longer trajectory, but not endless time. So.
I have a question from the Zoom chat from our participants online. And this individual asks, some of your work is so sculptural. Have you ever considered making a single object in addition of one, perhaps?
I have tried a number of times to make one-of-a-kind books, but that's not answering the question exactly. But for the one-of-a-kind thing, my brain just thinks in additions. I think, okay, I'm going to do one of a kind. And it's like, well, if you change this one thing, you could make 5. And if you change it like this, you could make 10. It's like, oh, stop with the one of a kind. Just make the addition because, so I always sort of translate my ideas into additions because I don't know why, because that's what I want to do. I mean, some part of me feels like I want to be able to get that work out into a number of different places. And then once you start doing that, it's hard to stop. So, but I really admire people who make one-of-a-kind books that clearly need to be one of a kind because of the material or whatever they're doing. But in terms of the sculptural thing, I do feel like a lot of my work is sculptural in nature, but I've never been drawn to just make sculpture, just like I'm going to make a sculpture, just the way I've never been drawn to making like one image. When I was in college, I studied printmaking, and one of the things about printmaking is additioning. So even though you're making one piece of art on a flat piece of paper, you can do that multiple times. So I think even from when I was really young in the field of art, I always was drawn to multiples. And so even if I were to make a sculptural piece of some kind, I'd probably think, how am I going to addition this? Who can help me like make more than one of these things? So, any other questions?
Hi, you've mentioned your students several times, and I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about your relationship as a teaching artist and your relationship back and forth in the classroom between your students, and does that show up in your work and how you balance that?
Oh, well, balancing that's kind of a hard one, as since you also teach, but I really get a lot out of teaching. It takes a lot of energy, but it's also very energizing to be talking to young people about their work and giving them, prompts to make work. And then you can see the wheels spinning and they're working on stuff. I don't feel like it shows up directly in my work, and I think teachers always have to be very careful about not accidentally stealing from their students. It's like, no, don't tell me that idea because, then, but I think it does show up in the work just because I'm always thinking about audience, and I'm not thinking about my students specifically as the audience, but of course, because I'm seeing them in the classroom all the time. When I just think about that vague idea of audience, I think my students are part of that mix. And so, and then I'm also talking to them about, you need to think about your reader, you need to think about this. So I think the fact that I'm always trying to deconstruct the creative process for students helps me then deconstruct it for myself. So I think my work would be really different if I didn't teach. But I can't really say how, because I can't run it back to the projector and be that other person. But I do feel like just spending so much time teaching really does affect the work. But the balance part, that's really hard because academic life is pretty full. And so I have a book that's due really soon, like I have to finish it by the end of June, and it's nowhere near where it needs to be. So I'm like, when are classes ending? I mean, I love my students, but I have to finish. I have a deadline too, and so I'm getting ready to finish that. Just jump on that as soon as I can. So one more, two more. Okay.
Hi, so I was wondering about how you think about yourself as a writer, because your prose in these are just as beautiful as the amazing forms. And I'm just wondering how you approach that practice of writing and how it fits into the process of your books.
So that's an interesting question because for many years, I didn't consider myself to be a writer. I was like, oh, I write and I use text in the books, but I'm not a writer. And it took me a long time to sort of take that apart. And I think what I mean by that, or what I meant by that in my own mind, was like when writers write, for the most part, their writing exists independent from the page or independent from the structure that it's in. And for me, my writing really only exists within my books. And a few times it's been excerpted for review and things like that. And it always makes me really uncomfortable to see it outside of the book. But at the same time, I realize at a certain point, I am a writer, even though my writing only can exist, or I only want it to exist in this one form. It's still writing, you know. But so now I consider myself to be an artist and a writer. But I usually don't use that. Like when Shannon read my biography, it didn't say, you know, she is an artist and a writer. So I still don't really see that as a separate thing from art. It's just that my art involves writing as well as image making and book making. So, but I often have that with my students where they're like, well, I want to make text, but I'm not a writer. It's like, you know, if you're using words, you're a writer, just do it. Try not to get hung up on that. Well, can I write? It's like, of course you can write. You know, it's just, you know, so sort of like that. But I do feel like it is an important thing to be able to acknowledge that I'm a writer, even though I really don't see that as a separate part of my identity still.
Hi, I had a question that's kind of along those lines. I saw that some of your earlier work is using other people's words, or for example, like your first book is using the Bible. Is there anything that makes you determine, or does anything really change between working with your own words or working with someone else's words, or is it just that's what inspired you at the moment, or anything in particular?
I haven't worked with someone else's words for a really long time, unless I'm doing a collaboration with another artist and we're using their words in the book. Or in the past, I've published the work of other artists in artist book form where I'm not on the title page, they're on the title page, even though I've sort of designed a lot of how the book is going to be experienced, but I did not do the writing or the image making. So, but I think in general, working with other people's work, it is a really different situation because it doesn't belong to you. You have to think about how the writer or the artist intended for their work to be seen. So one of the things that we had at Mills College was there was a contemporary writers series where the writing program would bring in poets for the most part to do readings. And our graduate students in book art had the option of inviting that writer to publish a broadside so they would design a broadside of the poet's work. It had to be a piece that had not been previously published. And then the student would design it, and then they would send an image of it to the writer, and the writer would have to approve. Because if you're using someone else's work, they need to be okay with what you're doing. So the first book I ever made in graduate school was from the Bible, because I didn't really know anything about book art at that time. It's like, well, okay, I'm going to do this thing that because I come from a very religious background, and I'm going to do a Bible story. And that helped So I was able to sort of interpret that, but of course it's, I don't have to get permission to use the Bible, but it got me started thinking about, okay, what am I trying to do with text and image, and how can I pivot towards using my own text and image, and so that happened pretty early on. But yeah, so that would be my answer. And a lot of students always ask, well, can I use someone else's work? It's like, well, okay, first we have to talk about copyright law, but then we have to talk about, what would they think about you using their work? Or are you honoring their work by using it? And then sometimes students will want to quote work. Well, can I change it? It's like, no, it's not your work. So these are interesting questions, though. So.
We have time for one more question, and I see a hand.
I saw one book of yours upstairs that has a mathematical flavor to it. And I have an interest in math myself, so I'm curious to hear more about how you came to make that book, and whether you know mathematicians.
The math book.
It's like almost like a Monopoly board, but
Yeah.
it curves around a little bit. It's got a lot of little things that fold over and have stuff on the back side.
Yeah.
It's a very clever book, and it's got a lot of some symbols and ideas from some fairly sophisticated mathematics. So
Okay, so you're gonna laugh, because I really hate math. And I don't understand. I go back to, I feel like the way they used to teach math in school was really bad. So I developed this aversion to math. I didn't understand what they were trying to teach me in math class. And so that book is really about trying to master a subject, but failing to master a subject. And so as you're opening it up, this really complicated mathematical equation appears. And I specifically wanted to use a really technical language that anybody could see that there was meaning embedded in it, but most people would not be able to read it. And so I decided to go with math, because that's been really hard for me. And so I have a friend who's in math, does a lot of math. I said, can you write me an equation that is really complicated, but it actually works? And so two of them worked on it together. And they're like, yeah, we can do that. So they did it, and they said, oh, there's a joke in here, mathematical joke. And they're explaining it to me, looking at all the symbol, blah, blah, blah. I said, okay, I can see your mouth moving, but it's just good. I can't get it. So, but they assured me that it was real, and that a mathematician would read it and be able to understand what it meant. And so while I was making this book, I had the manuscript, and I was teaching a workshop somewhere, and I was being hosted by this book art instructor, and her husband was a mathematician. I said, oh, will you look at this? So to make sure, it was made for me for this book. He's reading, oh, haha. And then he goes on. So there really was a joke embedded in the math. So, but to this day, I have no idea what it says, because that's sort of the whole idea of that experience. Yeah, well, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Julie. We're so happy to have you. Thank you.